The audible agony of a grieving family greets the casket of Officer Ariana Preston as it arrives at Trinity United Church of Christ.
For you are with me, your rod and your staff comfort me.
This is a day her family couldn't have anticipated, and a ceremony that's become all too routine for Chicago police officers.
She had just finished protecting Chicago's streets. Minutes later, teenagers would gun her down in front of her own home and steal the weapon she swore to serve with. Her name was Ariana Preston. She was 24 years old, a Chicago police officer, a graduate student studying law, a mentor to at-risk youth, a daughter, a sister, a woman with a future so bright her family could barely keep up with her ambitions. And on May 6, 2023, at 1:45 in the morning, all of that ended. Because 4 young men decided they needed money for a barbecue. You heard that right, a barbecue. What started as a girlfriend's casual request for $20 spiraled into a violent crime spree that tore through Chicago's South Side in less than 2 hours. Multiple victims, multiple robberies, a stolen vehicle, and finally, a confrontation with an off-duty officer who fought back. But here's what makes this case so haunting, so infuriating, and so preventable. Ariana Preston wasn't just another victim of random violence. She was trained, she was armed, she was vigilant, and she still didn't stand a chance. In this episode, we're going to walk you through the exact timeline of that robbery spree, minute by minute, victim by victim, and show you how a trivial request turned into a deadly rampage, and the chilling confession from the teen who admitted to pulling the trigger. We're going to show you the evidence they tried to burn, the service weapon they stole and sold, one that has never been recovered. The 4 young faces now charged with first-degree murder. But most importantly, we're going to break down what this case reveals about youth violence, officer safety, and the systemic gaps that allow crime sprees like this to happen in the first place. Because this isn't just a story about one tragic night. It's a story about a pattern, a cycle, that cities across America are struggling to break. So if you've ever wondered how a promising young officer ends up dead steps from her own front door, if you've ever asked yourself what drives teenagers to commit murder over pocket change, or if you've ever questioned whether we're doing enough to protect the people who protect us, stay with me. Because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what went wrong, and more importantly, what we can do to make sure it never happens again. Welcome to the Crime Anatomy. I'm your host, and today we're dissecting one of the most heartbreaking cases to come out of Chicago. A 24-year-old police officer, gunned down in her own driveway. If you're new here, consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. Stories like this aren't just content. They're warnings. They show us how systems fail, how quickly a life can be taken, and what we must do to stop it from happening again. This is the story of Ariana Preston. Before we dive into the darkness of that night, you need to understand who Ariana Preston really was, because the headlines will tell you she was a fallen officer. The news reports will tell you she was a victim of violence. But those labels don't even begin to capture the woman behind the badge. Ariana Michaela Preston was born on June 7, 1998, in Chicago, a city she would spend her entire life trying to make better. She grew up in a close-knit family, raised by her mother, Dion Moon, alongside her twin siblings. From an early age, those who knew her described her as confident, determined, and fiercely loyal. She wasn't the type to sit on the sidelines. If there was a problem, she wanted to fix it. If someone needed help, she was the first to step up. That drive led her to Illinois State University, where she pursued a degree with one clear goal in mind: public service. She didn't just want a career, she wanted a mission. And after graduating, she made a decision that surprised no one who knew her. She joined the Chicago Police Department. But here's the thing. Ariana didn't see policing as the end goal. She saw it as the beginning. While working as a patrol officer in the 5th District, Calumet, one of Chicago's most challenging areas, she was simultaneously enrolled as a graduate student at Loyola University School of Law. She was studying. She was planning. She was building toward something bigger. Friends and family say she had her sights set on federal law enforcement, specifically the FBI. She wanted to work cases that mattered, cases that could change systems, cases that could save lives on a larger scale. And she wasn't just talk. Aréanah had been on the force for 2.5 years at the time of her death. And in that short time, she'd already made an impression. She was 24 years old, working a dangerous job, pursuing a master's degree, and still finding time to invest in her community. Her mother, Dion Moon, would later describe her daughter as someone who wanted to give back to the neighborhood she loved. She saw people worth fighting for. And that's what makes her death so unbearably tragic. Because Ariana Preston wasn't just a cop doing a job. But on the night of May 6, 2023, all of that promise, all of that potential, came to a violent, senseless end. Aréanah had just finished a shift. She was exhausted, like any officer working the overnight hours in a high-crime district. She drove home to the Avalon Park neighborhood, a quiet residential area near Blackstone Avenue and 81st Street. She pulled into her driveway. She got out of her car, and that's when 4 teenagers in a stolen vehicle decided she would be their next target. Now, before we get to that moment, before we walk through the final horrifying minutes of Ariana Preston's life, you need to understand how those 4 young men ended up in front of her house. Because this wasn't random. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was the culmination of a calculated, escalating spree that had been building for hours. And it all started with a phone call about a barbecue. Let's rewind to the hours before Ariana Preston was killed. Because to understand how a 24-year-old police officer ended up dead in her own driveway, you have to understand the chain of events that led 4 teenagers to that exact spot at that exact time. It started with something so trivial, so absurdly mundane, that it almost doesn't feel real. Around midnight on May 6, 2023, an 18-year-old named Jaquan Buchanan received a phone call from his girlfriend. She told him she needed money for a barbecue, not for rent, not for an emergency, a barbecue. And instead of brushing it off, instead of telling her to wait until morning, Jaquan Buchanan made a decision that would destroy multiple lives. He decided to go get that money, by force. He wasn't alone. He called up 3 others. Trevor Breland, 19 years old, Joseph Brooks, 19 years old, and Jalen Frazier, just 16 years old. Together, the 4 of them climbed into a stolen Dodge Avenger, a vehicle they'd taken earlier that night, and set out into the streets of Chicago's South Side. All 4 were dressed in black. All 4 wore face coverings, and all 4 were armed. What followed was a violent, escalating crime spree that would span nearly 2 hours and leave a trail of terrified victims in its wake. The first robbery happened near East 46th Street, in a quiet residential area where a woman was walking alone. Surveillance footage and witness statements later revealed that the stolen Avenger pulled up beside her. 2 of the teens jumped out, guns drawn, and demanded everything she had. Her purse, her phone, her wallet, her keys. She complied. She had no choice. And the 4 young men sped off into the night, emboldened by how easy it had been. But they didn't stop there. Over the next hour, the group continued their rampage. Prosecutors would later describe a pattern. They cruised through South Side neighborhoods, looking for vulnerable targets. People walking alone, people getting out of cars, people who wouldn't see them coming until it was too late. Each robbery followed the same script. The Avenger would pull up. 2 or more of the teens would exit, weapons raised. They'd demand valuables, phones, wallets, jewelry, cash. And then they'd disappear back into the vehicle before anyone could react. Witnesses described the terror of those moments. The shock of seeing masked figures appear out of nowhere. The cold metal of a gun barrel. The helplessness of handing over everything you have and praying they don't pull the trigger. And with each successful robbery, the group grew bolder, more aggressive, more reckless. By 1:30 a.m., they'd hit multiple victims across the South Side. They had cash. They had phones. They had stolen property piling up in the back seat of a stolen car. But it still wasn't enough. The Dodge Avenger they were driving wasn't just transportation. It was a weapon in itself. Stolen earlier that evening, the vehicle gave them mobility, anonymity, and a quick escape route after each attack. It allowed them to cover ground fast, to strike in different neighborhoods, to avoid being pinned down by police. And they knew it. Prosecutors would later reveal that the group had discussed the importance of ditching the car and destroying evidence once the spree was over. They weren't amateurs. They weren't acting on impulse. They were calculating. They were planning. And they were about to make the worst decision of their lives. By 1:40 in the morning, the stolen Avenger was cruising through the Avalon Park neighborhood, a quiet residential area on Chicago's south side. Tree-lined streets, single-family homes, the kind of place where people feel safe enough to park in their own driveways. The four teens were still hunting, still looking for one more target, one more score. And that's when they saw her, a woman alone, pulling into a driveway near Blackstone Avenue and 81st Street. Getting out of her car, vulnerable, unaware. They didn't know she was a police officer. They didn't know she was armed. They didn't know she'd just finished a shift protecting the very streets they were terrorizing. All they saw was an opportunity. The Avenger slowed, the engine idled, and two of the teens, Joseph Brooks and at least one other, prepared to exit the vehicle. This was supposed to be just another robbery, just another victim, just another quick score before they called it a night and torched the car. But Ariana Preston wasn't just another victim. Ariana had just finished her shift with the Chicago Police Department. She was exhausted, mentally drained from hours of patrolling one of the city's most dangerous districts. All she wanted was to get inside, decompress, and rest. But she was also trained. She was vigilant, and she was armed. As she stepped out of her vehicle and began walking toward her front door, she likely sensed something was wrong. Maybe she heard the engine. Maybe she saw the Avenger idling at the curb. Maybe some instinct, honed by 2.5 years on the force, told her to be ready. But even training, even vigilance, even a service weapon can't always stop an ambush. Because that's exactly what this was. The stolen Dodge Avenger came to a full stop. The doors opened, and two masked figures stepped out, guns already drawn. They moved fast, aggressive, confident. They approached Ariana Preston with the same cold efficiency they'd used on every other victim that night. Weapons raised, demands shouted, expecting compliance. But Ariana didn't comply. She reached for her service weapon, and in that split second, that single moment of resistance, everything escalated. Surveillance footage from nearby homes, later reviewed by investigators and referenced in court filings, captured what happened next. The footage shows muzzle flashes, multiple shots fired, chaos erupting in the quiet residential street. Ariana Preston fought back. She drew her weapon. She returned fire. But she was outnumbered, outgunned, caught off guard. And Joseph Brooks, 19 years old, armed and desperate, pulled the trigger. Twice. One bullet struck Ariana in the face. Another hit her neck. She collapsed in her own driveway, steps from her front door, bleeding out on the pavement of the neighborhood she'd sworn to protect. The two teens didn't hesitate. They grabbed her service weapon, the very tool she'd used to serve her community, and ran back to the Avenger. Within seconds, the vehicle sped off into the night, leaving Ariana Preston dying alone in the darkness. 5 minutes later, a Chicago police officer responding to another nearby incident stumbled upon the scene. He found Ariana down, unresponsive, bleeding heavily from her wounds. He immediately called for backup and began rendering aid. Paramedics arrived within minutes. She was rushed to the University of Chicago Medical Center, where doctors fought desperately to save her life. But the damage was too severe. The wounds, too catastrophic. At 2:15 a.m., Ariana Michaela Preston, 24 years old, Chicago police officer, law student, mentor, daughter's sister, was pronounced dead. And somewhere in the city, four teenagers were speeding through the streets in a stolen car, carrying a murdered officer's weapon and planning their next move. Let's slow down and walk through those final moments in excruciating detail. Because this isn't just about what happened, it's about understanding how a trained, armed police officer could be ambushed and killed in her own driveway, and what that tells us about the nature of these kinds of attacks. Ariana Preston had no reason to expect what was coming. Yes, she was a police officer. Yes, she was trained to be aware of her surroundings. But she'd just finished a grueling shift. She was in her own neighborhood. She was steps from her front door. This was supposed to be the safest moment of her night. But for Joseph Brooks, Trevor Breland, Jaquan Buchanan, and Jalen Frazier, Ariana Preston was just another target. They didn't see a police officer. They didn't see a woman with a family, with dreams, with a future. They saw someone alone, someone vulnerable, someone they could rob. The stolen Dodge Avenger pulled up to the curb. The engine idled, and in the back seat, a decision was made. Brooks and at least one other would exit the vehicle and approach the target. They moved with the same cold efficiency they'd used all night. Doors open, feet hit the pavement, guns drawn. Aréanah likely heard them before she saw them. The sound of car doors, footsteps, voices. She turned, and in that instant, she understood exactly what was happening. Ariana Preston was trained for moments like this. The Chicago Police Academy drills officers on threat assessment, on drawing their weapon under pressure, on making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. But here's the brutal reality. No amount of training can fully prepare you for an ambush, especially when you're outnumbered, caught off guard, and facing multiple armed attackers who have the element of surprise. Prosecutors later revealed that surveillance footage from nearby homes captured the confrontation. The footage shows two figures approaching Aréanah rapidly. It shows her reaching for her service weapon, and shows muzzle flashes, multiple shots fired from both sides. Aréanah fought back. She drew her weapon. She returned fire. But she was facing at least two armed attackers, possibly more. And they had already decided they were willing to kill. In the days following the shooting, Chicago police arrested all four suspects. And during interrogations, Joseph Brooks made a confession that would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. He admitted it. He told investigators that he was the one who shot Ariana Preston. He described the moment, the approach, the confrontation, the moment she reached for her weapon, and he admitted that he fired twice. The first bullet struck Aréanah in the face, shattering bone and tissue. The second hit her neck, severing critical blood vessels and causing massive hemorrhaging. Either wound alone would have been catastrophic. Together, they were instantly fatal. Aréanah collapsed in her driveway, her service weapon falling from her hand. And in the chaos of those final seconds, Brooks and his accomplice did something that would haunt investigators for months to come. They stole her gun, Ariana Preston's service weapon, a firearm issued to her by the Chicago Police Department. A tool she'd carried every day for 2.5 years was taken from the scene. Prosecutors later revealed that the weapon was sold, passed from hand to hand in Chicago's underground gun market. And despite extensive efforts by law enforcement, despite raids and arrests and investigations, that weapon has never been recovered. Think about what that means. Somewhere in Chicago, someone is in possession of a murdered police officer's gun. A weapon that was supposed to protect the community is now in the hands of criminals. A symbol of Aréanah's service has become a symbol of the system's failure to bring complete justice. And every day that weapon remains missing is a reminder that this case, this tragedy, isn't fully resolved. Within seconds of the shooting, Brooks and his accomplice ran back to the stolen Avenger. They jumped inside, and the vehicle sped off into the night, tires screeching, leaving Ariana Preston bleeding out on the pavement. Inside the car, the four teens were likely in a state of panic. They'd just committed murder. They'd just killed a police officer. And they knew, they had to know, that every cop in Chicago would soon be hunting them. But they didn't turn themselves in. They didn't abandon the vehicle and scatter. Instead, they made a calculated decision: destroy the evidence. Sometime in the early morning hours of May 6th, the stolen Dodge Avenger was found engulfed in flames in a vacant lot on Chicago's South Side. The fire was deliberate. Investigators later determined that the suspects had doused the vehicle in accelerant and set it ablaze in an attempt to destroy forensic evidence. Fingerprints, DNA, ballistic residue, anything that could link them to the crime. It was a desperate move, a last-ditch effort to cover their tracks. But it didn't work. Despite the fire, investigators were able to recover critical evidence from the burned-out shell of the vehicle. Forensic teams found traces of DNA. They matched the vehicle identification number to the stolen car report, and they began piecing together the timeline of the robbery spree. Within 48 hours, they had their suspects. Back at the scene of the shooting, the officer who discovered Ariana Preston immediately called for backup. Within minutes, the quiet residential street was flooded with police vehicles, ambulances, and crime scene investigators. Paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Aréanah, but the wounds were too severe. She was rushed to the University of Chicago Medical Center, where trauma surgeons fought to save her life. But there was nothing they could do. At 2:15 a.m., Ariana Michaela Preston was pronounced dead, and across the city, the Chicago Police Department began mobilizing for one of the most intensive manhunts in recent memory. News of Ariana's death spread quickly. By sunrise, local media outlets were reporting the shooting. By midday, the story had gone national. A 24-year-old police officer killed in her own driveway after finishing a shift protecting the community. The outrage was immediate and overwhelming. Fellow officers were devastated. Community members were horrified. And Ariana's family, her mother, her siblings, her friends, were left to grapple with a loss so sudden, so violent, so senseless, that it defied comprehension. Dion Moon, Ariana's mother, would later describe the moment she received the news as the worst moment of her life. Her daughter, her bright, ambitious, caring daughter, was gone, and no amount of justice, no number of arrests, no length of prison sentence would ever bring her back. But even in the depths of that grief, Dion made a decision. She would not let her daughter's death be in vain. She would speak out. She would demand accountability. And she would fight to make sure Ariana's name stood for something more than tragedy. Within hours of the shooting, the Chicago Police Department's homicide unit launched a full-scale investigation. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, collecting surveillance footage from nearby homes and businesses. They interviewed witnesses. They processed the crime scene for forensic evidence, and they began connecting the dots. The stolen Dodge Avenger, the string of robberies across the South Side, the timeline that placed the vehicle near Ariana's home at the exact time of the shooting. It all pointed to one conclusion. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was the culmination of a calculated, escalating crime spree. And the people responsible were still out there, but not for long. Drop a comment below. Have you ever felt unsafe in your own neighborhood? What do you think could have stopped this? Your voice matters, and I want to hear from you. Let's keep this conversation going. The manhunt for Ariana Preston's killers was swift, aggressive, and relentless. The Chicago Police Department pulled out every resource at its disposal. Detectives worked around the clock. Forensic teams analyzed every piece of evidence. And within 48 hours, they had their suspects. On May 8th, just 2 days after Ariana's murder, Chicago police announced that they had arrested 4 individuals in connection with her death. Trevor Breland, 19 years old. Joseph Brooks, 19 years old. Jaquan Buchanan, 18 years old. Jalen Frazier, 16 years old. All 4 were taken into custody without incident. And all 4 were charged with first-degree murder, felony murder, armed robbery, burglary, possession of a stolen vehicle, unlawful use of a weapon, and arson. The charges were staggering. Each one carried the potential for decades, if not life, in prison. But for investigators, the arrests were just the beginning. Now came the hard part, building an airtight case that would hold up in court. Prosecutors had a mountain of evidence to work with. First, there was the surveillance footage. Multiple cameras in the Avalon Park neighborhood had captured the stolen Dodge Avenger pulling up to Ariana's home. The footage showed 2 figures exiting the vehicle, approaching Ariana, and the muzzle flashes from a shooting. Second, there was forensic evidence from the burned-out Avenger. Despite the suspect's attempts to destroy the vehicle, investigators recovered DNA samples, fingerprints, and ballistic residue that linked all 4 suspects to the car. Third, there were the victims from the earlier robberies. Multiple witnesses came forward to identify the stolen Avenger and describe the masked attackers. Their testimonies corroborated the timeline prosecutors were building, a 2-hour crime spree that ended in murder. And fourth, perhaps most damning of all, there was Joseph Brooks' confession. During police interrogations, Joseph Brooks admitted to shooting Ariana Preston. He described the approach, the confrontation, and the moment he pulled the trigger. His confession was detailed, specific, and it gave prosecutors the direct link they needed to secure a murder conviction. But Brooks wasn't the only one talking. Investigators also obtained statements from the other suspects, each of whom tried to minimize their own involvement while implicating the others. It was a classic case of criminals turning on each other once the reality of their situation set in. One of the most controversial aspects of the case was the decision to charge Jalen Frazier, just 16 years old at the time of the shooting, as an adult. Under Illinois law, juveniles can be charged as adults for certain serious offenses, including first-degree murder. Prosecutors argued that the severity of the crime, the premeditated nature of the robbery spree, and Frazier's active participation in the events justified adult charges. The decision sparked debate. Advocates for juvenile justice reform argued that charging a 16-year-old as an adult was excessive, that it ignored the developmental differences between teenagers and adults, and that it prioritized punishment over rehabilitation. But prosecutors and Ariana's family saw it differently. They argued that Frazier had made a conscious choice to participate in a violent crime spree, that he had been armed, that he had been present when Aréanah was killed, and that the consequences of those choices should reflect the gravity of the harm caused. Ultimately, the court sided with the prosecution. Jalen Frazier would face trial as an adult. All 4 suspects were held without bail pending trial. Prosecutors argued, and the court agreed, that the defendants posed a significant danger to the community and a substantial flight risk. The decision meant that Breland, Brooks, Buchanan, and Frazier would remain in custody for the duration of the legal proceedings. No bond, no release, no second chances. For Ariana's family was a small measure of justice, but it was also a reminder that no amount of legal accountability would bring their daughter back. Despite the arrests, despite the confessions, despite the mountain of evidence, one critical piece of the case remained unresolved: Ariana Preston's service weapon. Prosecutors revealed that the gun had been stolen from the scene and later sold. But despite extensive efforts by law enforcement, raids, interviews, undercover operations, the weapon was never recovered. That missing gun became a symbol of the case's lingering incompleteness. It represented not just a piece of evidence, but a piece of Aréanah herself, her tool of service, her means of protection, now lost in the criminal underworld. And it raised a chilling question. How many other crimes had been committed with that weapon since it was stolen? How many other lives had been endangered because of that one violent act? As of the time of Ariana's death and the immediate aftermath, the legal process was just beginning. The suspects faced arraignment, pre-trial hearings, and eventually a full trial. Prosecutors made it clear they would seek the maximum penalties allowed under Illinois law. They would present every piece of evidence. They would call every witness, and they would fight to ensure that Ariana Preston's killers spent the rest of their lives behind bars. But even as the legal machinery ground forward, Ariana's family and the broader Chicago community were left to grapple with a more fundamental question. How do you move forward after a loss like this? In the days and weeks following Ariana Preston's murder, Chicago mourned. Her death wasn't just a tragedy for her family. It was a blow to the entire city. A young officer, dedicated to service, killed in her own driveway. It was a kind of loss that reverberates through communities, that forces people to confront uncomfortable truths about violence, safety, and the fragility of life. Within hours of the news breaking, tributes began pouring in. Fellow officers changed their social media profile pictures to honor Aréanah. Community members left flowers and candles at the site of the shooting. Local churches held prayer vigils. The Chicago Police Department released a statement calling Aréanah a dedicated officer who embodied the values of service and sacrifice. The Fraternal Order of Police described her as a rising star whose potential had been stolen by senseless violence. But perhaps the most powerful tributes came from the people who knew her best: her family, her friends, her colleagues. Ariana's mother, Dion Moon, became the public face of the family's grief. In interviews and at memorials, she spoke about her daughter with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. She described Aréanah as a young woman who wanted to change the world, who believed in the power of service, who saw law enforcement not as a job, but as a calling. She didn't have to become a police officer. Dion said in one interview, she could have done anything, but she chose this because she wanted to give back. She wanted to protect people. She wanted to make a difference. But Dion also spoke about the anger she felt. Anger at the senselessness of her daughter's death. Anger at the system that had failed to prevent it. Anger at the 4 young men who had stolen her daughter's future. "They took her from us for nothing," she said. "For barbecue. For $20. How do you make sense of that?" Yet, even in her grief, Dion made a decision. She would not let her daughter's death be the end of her story. She would fight to ensure that Aréanah's name stood for something more than tragedy. In the months following her death, Loyola University School of Law made a decision that brought both comfort and heartbreak to Aréanah's family. They would posthumously award her the master's degree she had been working toward. At a ceremony attended by her mother and siblings, university officials presented the degree to Dion Moon. It was a recognition of Aréanah's academic dedication, her intellectual ambition, and the future she had been building. But it was also a reminder of everything she would never get to do. She would never walk across that stage herself. She would never practice law. She would never join the FBI. She would never fulfill the dreams that had driven her for so many years. In the wake of Aréanah's death, multiple organizations and community groups came together to create lasting tributes to her memory. The Preston for Peace Foundation was established to continue the work Aréanah had been passionate about: mentoring at-risk youth, violence interruption programming, and community outreach. The foundation partners with local schools and nonprofits to provide resources, support, and alternatives to street crime. Loyola University created a scholarship in Aréanah's name, providing financial assistance to students pursuing careers in public service and criminal justice. Local community organizations launched youth programs focused on conflict resolution, education, and employment, all themes that Aréanah had championed during her life. These initiatives were intentional. They were designed to ensure that Aréanah's legacy wasn't defined by her death, but by the values she lived by: service, compassion, and a belief in the power of community. Aréanah's death also sparked broader conversations about officer safety, youth violence, and systemic failures. City officials, community leaders, and law enforcement organizations began asking hard questions. How do we protect officers when they're off duty? What drives teenagers to commit such violent crimes? What can we do to intervene before young people reach the point of no return? These weren't easy questions, and they didn't have easy answers. But Aréanah's death forced Chicago and cities across the country to confront them. Ariana Preston wasn't just a badge number. She wasn't just a headline. She wasn't just another statistic in Chicago's ongoing struggle with violence. She was a daughter, a sister, a mentor, a dreamer. She was 24 years old, and she had plans, big plans, to change the world. She wanted to work for the FBI. She wanted to take on cases that mattered, cases that could save lives, cases that could reform broken systems. She believed in the power of service. She believed in her community. She believed that one person working hard and caring deeply could make a difference. And she was right, because even in death, Ariana Preston is making a difference. Her name has become a rallying cry for change. Her story has forced uncomfortable conversations about youth violence, officer safety, and systemic failures. Her legacy lives on through scholarships, foundations, and community programs that continue the work she started. But here's the thing, that legacy isn't complete. Because somewhere in Chicago, Aréanah's service weapon is still out there. The gun she carried to protect others is now in the hands of criminals. And every day it remains missing is a reminder that this story isn't over. So what can you do? What state or country are you watching from? Have you witnessed youth violence in your area? What do you think could have prevented Aréanah's death? Your voice matters. Your perspective matters. And I want to hear from you, because this isn't just about one tragic night in Chicago. This is about a pattern, a cycle, a system that's failing our young people and our communities. And the only way we break that cycle is together. This is the Crime Anatomy, where we don't just tell the story. We dissect the system that let it happen. Because understanding the crime is the first step to preventing the next one. Rest in power, Ariana Preston.